You've dedicated your work to redefining masculinity for the next generation. What initially drew you to this mission, and what does healthy masculinity look like in practice versus the very worn out and well known traditional models many of us grew up with?
Yeah, I mean, in the early days of Next Gen Men, I used to actually say, "Oh, we're redefining masculinity," and people would be like, "Great, what's the new definition?" And we'd be like, "Oh, well, wait, like what we're actually doing is undefining masculinity, right?" And I think with the undefining piece, as soon as there's a toxic masculinity, that means there's a healthy masculinity. As soon as there's a positive masculinity, that means there's a negative masculinity. As soon as there's a traditional masculinity, that means there's a modern masculinity. The way that we keep having this conversation about masculinity kind of really perpetuates this binary: you're with us, you're against us. And if we could get to a place where we're truly undefining masculinity, that means that, I think I read once somewhere said there's 4 billion different ways to be a man because there's 4 billion different kinds of men, right? And so that's really, I think, the liberating piece is yours is ultimately different than mine, is different than, the next guy on the street. And all of those need to be equal and valid as long as that they're not harmful to that individual and to those around them.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. I think we live in a culture, as you know, that loves to pigeonhole people and categorize them and limit us to, yeah, the different categories that, to your point, are interpreted on an individual level. And I'm curious if you have found through the undefining masculinity some main words or patterns that you have consciously stopped associating with or started creating maybe some distance from?
That's a good question. I don't know if it's like an absolute no or distance or whatever. Like, I think some of it is really a reframe. And Dr. Brendan Kwiatkowski talked about this in one of his videos, and it really stuck with me. But it's like, okay, this narrative that men need to be protectors and providers, it is persistent over all this period of time. But what is actually at the root of protecting and providing? Like, what is the experience that you feel if someone protects you and someone provides for you? It's safety. And so what does it mean to be a safe man, right? Safe to yourself, safe to your community, safe to your partner, all those types of things. And so I think it's reframing some of those things, some of those narratives. The conference that you and I were at earlier, Jason Rosario talked about how it's moving from protection to presence, and moving from, or I think it was like provision to presence, and then protection to partnership, right? And it's great. I love alliteration. They're all P words, right? But like, I don't think we need to throw anything out. I don't think we need to say masculinity is trash, let's start over. I think it's just an evolution.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think there's a lot of well thought and well formed understandings and baselines of masculinity that have actually allowed us the freedom to redefine it and expand it and all those things. So I appreciate those 4P framework along with, yeah, your thoughts.
Can I
You
add one more
speak.
thing?
Oh, yeah, yeah,
I
please.
th- I think that like you can also see how that is up for grabs right now, because let's just take provider for example. In our like hyper capitalist society, it's not as easy for all men to be providers the way they used to be, right? Like nowadays you also just need like dual income households because everything's so freaking expensive and our wages aren't keeping up. And you can get me on an anti-capitalist rant in another podcast. But if I'm a provider and I can't do it the way that my father did it, the way that my grandfather did it, I have choices. I can fight to get that time back where men were the default breadwinner and we have those traditional roles and men didn't have to compete with women in the workforce. And maybe we could have an anti-migrant conversation within that too, so that it's that way. That's an option. Or I redefine what provision means. And provision can mean I'm providing care, I'm providing connection, I'm providing empathy, right? Like I'm providing the thing that is being asked of me by my partner, by my child, by my community, right? And so, like, I really do think that is the battleground, is like we still agree that, an identity associated with men and masculinity is provision. Which way do you want to go with it?
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. I said this on a previous episode. Essentially, what you're getting at, and the language I would use is seeing how you can provide, including, but certainly beyond financially. And the tried and true ultimate use case that I like to remind people, right, is how many of us grew up with fathers that technically provided by definition financially, and yet many of us have a deep wounding or longing of not being known or provided for emotionally and mentally, even physically with touch, and how you can only extract so much meaning and safety from the financial piece. If someone provides for you, but are not providing in the other ways, there is a level of insecurity and psychological instability you experience as a human. And I agree that we have to certainly include baseline. It's important to have dignity as a human to work and to work towards something that also, you know, uh, allows you the baseline, right? Food, housing, shelter with the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and we would be missing out on that definition and understanding if yet another generation, I don't know if I'm a millennial, I don't know if you are, but kind of overlooks the need to provide in an expanded definition.
Yeah, I mean, I think, one thing that we can agree on in, these polarized times is like the health of our family matters to us, right? But the reality is you see some families, and, I'm peddling in anecdotes and stereotypes now in a way, but like, they have everything. They have the cars, the nanny, the summer house, the whatever, but the children in that family never see their parents because their parents are so off providing, and the kids end up really screwed up because they're missing that provision of the what they actually needed, even though they had all these material things. And then on the flip side, you see families that are paycheck to paycheck, don't have all the opportunities, and they all they have is kind of each other and the roof over their heads and the meal that they get to share together. But they laugh together, they have traditions, they celebrate, and they grow up and they say, well, I was really well taken care of, even though I didn't have the fanciest thing and all those types of things. So, how do we balance that narrative and not put too much weight on the thing that doesn't always really matter? Like, if you can pay the bills, great. But beyond that, like, where are you? What is enough, right? And where do you take that excess?
Yeah, and I think that gets to your comment about the hyper capitalistic society we live in. If we look globally, at more collectivist based cultures, they aren't compromising family and tradition and rituals and values. And those are things that, we are seeing a current crisis in of, people because they have over prioritize work, they only identify with work, and then they're having identity crisis, and this is and then you're hyper isolated because you're just working, you're not having time for relationships, starting with family, but certainly outside of that with friends. And this is in my humble estimation, a contributing factor to the suicide rates and the depression and loneliness among men is just this missing the mark on the values, as you're saying. Are you willing to leave everything else behind to really, get a few more dollars in the bank?
Let me affirm your intuition in that sense. We know that 3 out of 4 suicides are men. The vast majority of male suicide is actually men 55 to 65. And so you got to think about what's going on for those guys. And what they're experiencing is that they have bought into a narrative of what it means to be a man. And it's like, if I cut off this emotional part of myself, if I, leave when my partner and my kid need me so that I can make this money, if I, make sure I work overtime instead of prioritizing a beer with my buddy. If I make all these sacrifices, I will have XYZ reward. And they get to the point and they're, separated from their partner, their kids aren't speaking to them, they don't have friends to turn to, and they're like, what the hell? This deal, it didn't work out, right? And so it's very sad, but like that's what's happening to guys at that age. And they're facing the end of their careers, and if all their meaning has been around earning, it's tough.
Yeah. I appreciate you shedding light on the statistics and the breakdown of that. And, I think it speaks to a systemic issue. And you often speak about the system and culture of masculinity. Can you help us understand how patriarchal structures actually harm men too, and why so many men struggle to see this connection?
Such a good question. I mean, I think first of all, like I like to start with the definition of patriarchy, right? And so an archain patriarchy, father power, put it together. And I think the hard part is that sometimes when that word comes up for people, they imagine, a round table with seven hooded men and they're the ones pulling the strings. But it's just this collection of narratives that we've built over our lifetime. And a lot of people like to say, "Oh, that was then, but not so much now." But okay, you and I were millennials. Let's think back on our father's generation and our grandfather's generation. So, for our grandfather, who was in positions of power in the government? Men. In religious institutions? Men. In corporations? Men. Like all the levers that influence our society were represented that way. It's changed a lot in those two generations, but we're not at 50-50 representation in government. We're not at 50% representation in corporate. We're not at 50-50% representation in religious institutions. So that legacy still persists in that way. And it's that legacy that we're measuring everything against. And women and girls and trans and non-binary individuals, their whole lives are told, you can't do this because of that, right? Whereas for us guys, we often don't question it because we just kind of follow the path laid out for us within this structure. And the reality is the vast majority of us wake up to this issue through trauma, mental health issues, job loss, relationship, like all those types of things. One of the few times where we think critically about gender is when someone critically about gender within a positive light is when someone hands us a tiny human being and says, here, this is yours, program it. And if it's a girl, we say, shit, like, here's the stuff that I need to change around this because I know, I got to polish the proverbial shotgun because I know how shitty guys can be. So rather than, changing men and masculinity, I'm going to focus on protecting my girl. And if it's a boy, we say, ooh, I hope he survives. Or I double down and make sure that he survives the gauntlet. Right. And so that's like one aspect of it. And then, I have this kind of timeline that I do in one of my keynotes and I call it Paper Cuts of Patriarchy. And it happens over different parts of our life, right? Like it happens, I think in an earlier part of the conversation, you said something about a missing physical touch from our fathers and men in our lives. That's what they call the father wound very early on. Men physically distance themselves from boy children before women do. So you're 3 years old, you don't have any sort of systemic or cultural view of the world, but you experience your mom, your aunt, your grandmother, women still kissing, cuddling, loving on you. And the men in your life have started to distance themselves physically from you. And you're like, but I was just a baby and you held me and what happened, right? And so you have no semblance of understanding that. Then, you go and you skin your knee and you come crying to your dad and you say, and all you want is the recognition and the comfort. And your dad says, that didn't hurt. Boys don't cry. Right. And then you're like, okay, that didn't hurt. Boys don't cry. And then, you go to school and, school isn't really working for a lot of boys these days. There's a whole myriad of reasons for that, but you're told that you're too rambunctious, too energetic, too this, too that, and you're just like, I'm 5, 6 years old, like I'm just trying to live, and you get this narrative of kind of how broken you are, and then you get socialized with other boys through the world of sports, and you have your hand hurts, and your coach says, up, like go play, and then you go do that, and then you're a teenager and you're told that the measure of a man is losing your virginity, and so all of your interactions with the opposite sex come through that lens. And we know from statistics that the vast majority of women's first experiences are unwanted, not necessarily like sexual assault, but not the way that they had hoped for themselves. And so then you think about a young man who has been distanced from intimacy by his loved ones, who's been told that his emotions don't matter and that when he faces adversity, he should just push up and push through. That's a young man who doesn't have the skills when a young woman says to him, I'm uncomfortable, I don't want this, to hear her and heed her. And I'm not saying that to make excuses, but we have to understand why this is the reality we exist within. And so that's all patriarchy harming us through, just becoming a boy to a man. But, patriarchy then keeps harming us by making it difficult to make male friendships, by, steeping us in a culture of competition and domination when it comes to workplaces, by making it so that we don't have health and help seeking behaviors to go get that thing checked out by the doctor, or to get some counseling on a regular basis, work with people like Wes. And I it's so funny to me to see how people will say, oh, men have a mental health issue. Why do we have a mental health issue? What is the system behind that? What is the culture behind that? And we're still unwilling to have that conversation in some arenas.
What a well articulated and laid out both understanding and explanation of patriarchy. I really appreciate so many points in there that resonated with me. One in particular, that father wound early on. Another statistic is that by the age of 2 or 3, boys are receiving in general a percent less touch than girls. So it's even been internalized within women in a way. And then you mentioned, having your aunt, your mom hug and kiss you. Another layer is that you're not seeing physical intimacy between men. You just see the strong handshakes, or, the hello. It's this awkward, like painful thing that guys feel like they have to tense up, before they come in for a physical interaction, and all that gets internalized. And you mentioned trauma, and I really appreciate you doing that, because I think there certainly is a difference between particular traumatic events like a car wreck, sexual assault, those things, and then let's say a general traumatic experience that mars or skews the perspective of who you are as a person more than a particular situation. And I think the ultimate negative result of the patriarchy and these systems is really the belief that a man is not worthy, that he doesn't have value, and that those things are internalized early on through all the things that you mentioned. But really the reason that then the later symptomology manifests itself is that deep belief. And you may say, oh, actually, many men present as self-reliant and that they don't need those things. And I would say that is a defense mechanism, because it's more painful to admit, actually, it's not that I don't need those things, it's I don't believe I'm worth those things. I don't believe I have a body worth taking care of and going to the doctor. I don't believe that, I'm worth engaging in physical touch and intimacy. I don't think I'm worth being vulnerable and sharing that I'm scared in a sexual experience, that I don't know what I'm doing, instead of trying to act like I do. And all these things play out in correlation to father wound. And I agree with you. I think it's our ability to help heal the man's wound in spirit in a way that helps him reconnect to himself, to others, romantically, from a social perspective, and all those things.
Yeah, really well said. And I think, just to double down on kind of what you said as well too, that the important thing is understanding that women uphold patriarchy as much as men do in certain ways as well too, right? Like, um, any woman who has a dating app that says, 6 feet, 6 figures, six pack, right? Like, it's like, again, the measure of a man. If you're not these things, don't bother, right? And, the point about mothers, there's research that shows mothers will allow boy babies to crawl up a steeper slope than girl babies, because they just inherently believe in they're not as fragile and that they can take bigger risks, right? And so it's really steeped in our culture and society. A lot of it is even in our gender equality discourse in a lot of ways. The fact that we have all these science, technology, engineering, math programs isn't always a gender equality initiative. It can be steeped within that, but it's a capitalist initiative, because that's where, in financial security exists for women. If it was a true gender equality initiative, we would look at where men are underrepresented, such as health, arts, education, literacy, right? And we don't have those complementary programs. And why? Because we don't pay the people in those roles what they're worth. And so, like I'm people don't like it, but I'm very firm at like calling out the systems as they are, patriarchy, capitalism, white supremacy, settler colonialism. To be able to transform it, we have to name it.
Yeah, I appreciate that acknowledgement of the underrepresentation for men. And then, to go back to the provision comment, we're finding the majority of men can't even uphold the pressured or inherited definition of what it means to provide, aka working a really high paying job. I know the report from Ecomundo came out, the State of American Men this year. I'll put it in the show notes. Highly recommend everyone read it. But that was a big stat that essentially, many men, the majority actually don't feel like they can live up to that. And we're seeing this, in my estimation, this really polarization mindset of men who are either like severely under functioning or what I would like to call over functioning, like they're hyper idolizing self improvement and gaining at all costs and just like trying to be in that 1% and, sacrificing everything else on their path. Or this feeling of, I can't even get out of bed. I can't hold a job. I can't keep a relationship. And, on that note, there's this interesting phenomenon where healthy masculinity gets conflated with self-improvement culture. So I'm just curious, what do you think men gravitate towards, or excuse me, why do you think men gravitate towards fixing themselves individually rather than examining the broader cultural systems that you've named that shape the masculine expectations?
Man, I wish I had the real answer to that. My opinion, some feels in your control, some feels not in your control, right? Like, and I say this not just from like, a work experience, but my own personal experience. Part of the reason why I co-founded Next Gen Men was my own struggles with mental health and depression in my late teens and early 20s. And at 19, my coping mechanisms were, substance abuse and aggression. And then I got my life kind of back on track. But at 22, despite, things being quote unquote good, had to face that down again. And I was dating a women's studies grad at the time, and she introduced me to this phenomena called gender norms of like, you shouldn't ask for help. You should always be stoic and never show emotion. And I was like, oh, that's what those are. It's laughable now. But my coping mechanism through like, okay, I'm broken was I'm going to grind. I'm going to, get good grades, get my life back on track, make money. I was a varsity athlete. I'm going to, get in good shape. I'm going to perform in this, right? It worked to an extent, but then like, is that sustainable over the course of your entire life and not to actually build that worth and self-care and relationships that can sustain you when you're not your best self? No. And I had to face that at 22. I was in the best shape of my life. I was a Canadian all academic athlete. I had all those like measures that say, yeah, you're good. Thumbs up, man. And I was still hollow and empty. So, I think, yeah, you could be on the David Goggins plan and whatnot, again, I don't know all the details of personal relationships, so I hope to not kind of cross that boundary. But there's a big conversation about his relationship with his ex partner and his daughter right now, and it's like, what was he doing when he could have been feeding those relationships, right? And I don't know what the answer to that is. So, what is it that guys are gravitating to, clinging to, that is actually filling their cup and their soul versus temporarily flowing through them?
Mm. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned him. I've had an interesting exposure to him because, similar to you, I was on this path. Not as much physically, though I would humbly consider myself a fairly athletic guy, but academically and all these things. And it was hitting a low point as well in my mental health in 2020. So I was in my was 26, and coming to this place where all the tricks in the bag ran out, and I just thought, oh wow, everything that brought me prominence and dominance and accolades, there's just no more of that. It was COVID, and there was a mix of things of what led to that and the symptoms of that. But either way, I think there was this looming question of like, wow, I have been running from my trauma and my wounds for all these years instead of just acknowledging, as you've said with the gender norms, that I need help, that I need to sit with this pain and not rush into busyness or productivity, that was going to get me further. And I ran into this interesting conundrum where I had a pretty domineering, like victim mindset, and finding David Goggins during that time was really helpful for me in instilling the belief that I can overcome hard things. And there was a series of people that, I would say were inspirational at the time. And I ended up doing this half Ironman race and this ultra marathon. And long story short, I kind of saw it as a rite of passage, kind of like finding the potential within me. But to your point in questioning his close relationships, I quickly realized like, yes, I needed challenge to address the victim mindset. But the other issue that led to the demise was my isolation. And I was a very social guy, but I realized I didn't let people in. What an ironic thing. I had a ton of friends, but no one really knew me. And realizing, yes, I want to keep this value of being challenged, rising to the occasion to find who I am in a really authentic manner. And it has to be partnered with, I can only go so far alone. And so when I found these podcasts like Huberman Labs and the Rich Roll podcast, and I wouldn't put Joe Rogan, but several other of these I would deem these self-improvement podcasts, I realized, to what end am I improving if it's just for me? I'm realizing the need to include others. So I'm just curious how you go about navigating that balance of like, it's important to take care of your body and your mind and your spirit. And that is to some degree an individual effort, surely, because it's your life. And how do you just check in and make sure that you're also doing it in community and with accountability to make sure you're just not, doing it alone?
I love where you're going with that question. And I mean, like, don't get me wrong, like I love a David Goggins video, like who's gonna carry the boats, when you're trying to do a bench press or whatever. But like also you gotta look at some of the language that's used, right? Like, forgive me if I'm crossing the line on your thing, but like if everyone else is a fucking pussy while you're doing this thing or the other thing, like that is a culture of domination. And to your point, like it's really hard to make friends when everyone else is a fucking pussy but you. And it's like, okay, like, how am I supposed to build a bridge when everyone is beneath me? So I think that's a thing that we can look at within that space. And then, how much like I run is 10K. Like I was a basketball player. We do a lot of sprints, right? But like how much time does an ultra marathon take, right? Like those are hours of running, and like those are hours you can't be forming friendships and relationships. So like, I think it's just being really cognizant of the trade-offs of those types of things. Not to say that, I have a protocol that people should follow, like a Huberman or anything like that. But I have a really nice ritual where Monday, Wednesday, Saturday, I go to the gym with three of my guy friends, and that's just every week. And then like Monday, Wednesday, we finish and we go to work after. But Saturday, we always go to the same cafe. We order the same thing, and we sit and shoot the shit for an hour and a half. And we've seen one guy go through his part supporting his partner through cancer. We've seen one guy have his own cancer scare and lose a testicle. We've seen a guy get married. We've seen another guy get engaged. Like, and we talk about that, and we talk about, I went through a separation last year, and so yeah, I just, that point you made about the community is just so salient, and you can prioritize your health and do those types of things, but you can do it in a way that invites other people in. And I think you look at some of the stuff out there, CrossFit communities, run clubs, like those types of things. Like it is really, I think, a positive thing to see some of this social stuff, and to be doing the exercise for the sake of the exercise and the community, not necessarily because I need to be the biggest, I need to be the fastest, I need to run the farthest, I need to, so I think that's a good thing necessarily to engage in.
Yeah, that's a brilliant insight, I think, and so normal. And I say that because I think it's so important to name that. When I first found all these guys like the David Goggins and these, endurance athletes, to your point about how long it takes, I thought that's insane. Like, there's no way that you're talking to anyone by doing that. And I think it just speaks to the toxic expression of doing things in extremes. And I love your approach that is just, it's very approachable. It's got its challenge. It takes commitment. You're showing up 3 times a week. Other people are showing up there, so they're relying on you. But yet it's it's integrated, you know? It feels like something that it becomes a rhythm in your life. And I put that to the test recently because, I like I said, I've been a very social person in my life. I've had a lot of really rich friendships in different communities. But one aspect was that I didn't have it in is exercise. And I thought, well, let me just see if anyone wants to get together and run. And so now every Saturday morning, I get together with some guys and we run, and then we have coffee and we talk. And it's a mix of ages and ideologies, political beliefs, and it's always just such a rich conversation. And to your point about learning to support each other, obviously your group's a tad smaller and more intimate, but it creates a space for guys to get real and share. And I think it just points to the fact of how easy it is in with technology, and especially here in the States. I'm sure Canada's similar, but I'm in my house right now with just my people, right? Then I get in the car by myself. Then I go somewhere else, let's say a cafe. I put in headphones by myself, right? Or I go to the gym by myself. And I think your approach of learning how to do a healthy habit like exercise, but not have the headphones in, and to dialogue and build that rapport. And also, many men do feel more comfortable opening up as they're doing something. I had a guy on the podcast who spoke how male mentorship primarily used to happen from a father to a son in agrarian society. You'd be alongside your dad as you worked or as he fixed the car, and you'd see him interact with other men and talk. And this is still alive and well in pop culture in the UK, but we've lost this sense of both intergenerational, but also same generation socialization. And I just appreciate your frame because now I have a 17-month-old and another on the way in January. And
Congratulations.
thank you. And I've thought like, damn, I have to find ways to connect with my buds, but I don't have enough time to like grab a beer on Friday, then go running Saturday separate. Like, I think the future of men's socialization, dare I say, a common form, is for us to learn to get together and do things that are benefiting us both individually and collectively. So thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, and I mean, I love the word you used there, normal, like, if I may suggest, like, everyone nowadays has a Stanley mug. You and your buddy should throw a beer in the Stanley mug, and while you push a stroller with your little newborn in it, go for a walk. And like, that's normal, and that's the type of stuff like, there's so much we can learn from women's socialization and their relationships in that way where like we don't need to go on an adventure into the woods to bond as men. Like we can run errands together. We can batch cook together, right? Like that's what a lot of women do. That's I think an opportunity to do that. And I think so many times we're trying to like optimize around the edges, right? Like what's the latest like protocol about this like supplement, and it's like, dude, are you sleeping 7 hours a night? Are you eating like mostly whole foods? And like, do you have some socialization? If you don't do those things, like all the other supplements or initiatives or taking one trip to do this men's group once a year somewhere, like that's all extra, but you don't have the normal, the baseline stuff.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that. It's so funny because as much as I agree, I sometimes have previously and maybe currently given to some of those lies of the hyper optimization, to use your beautiful language, around the edges. And, my wife's Italian American and she's like, take it easy, man. She's like, everything in moderation. Like, literally, it's all good, like, just do the basics. But yeah, I'm glad you doubled down on the word normal. I think that's important. Speaking of normal, many men feel trapped between the normative societal expectations and their authentic selves, dealing with judgment for making non-traditional choices, social media comparison and pressure to conform to these subconscious or conscious ways of being a man. How can men navigate standing up to these social norms while maintaining meaningful relationships and community? Because I find many men feel there's a trade off, right? I can be authentic, I can redefine masculinity and express it in a unique way, and I'll get made fun of. My buddies won't hang out. I won't have deep conversations, or I just have to fully conform, right? I just have to sit down, be quiet. I don't want to approach, asking how the week is or expressing emotions, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, how can we navigate those social norms and maintaining connection?
There's two things I want to say to this. One is Ruth Whitman recently wrote a book called Boy Mom, and in it she coins this phrase impossible masculinity. And I think it's so good because in a post Me Too world, there's like this narrative of what it is to be a good man in, hetero relationships in and around women and rights and equity and justice and all that type of stuff. And then we have the masculinity narrative that is, proliferating in a lot of like online spaces and those types of things. And she's looking at it mostly from the perspective of young men, but like you look at that, and you're like, I can't be both those things at the same time, right? And so it's this kind of impossible masculinity. And so that's kind of what I was hearing in kind of what you set up there. But on the other hand, like, geez, like, what is more masculine than like standing up for your way of being, right? Like, is it not emasculating to conform and to, kowtow to, being teased for this, that, and the other thing? Like, it's just really funny to me how these narratives aren't always consistent, which to me shows that they're not definitive, right? Because otherwise, then we would all be just our own men all the time, right? But no, we a group of conformists because we're people who grew up and are socialized to belong, and we want to belong to that group. So I mean, I think you'd really just have to question the quality of things, right? Like when you say, oh, my buddies are going to make fun of me or whatever, are they your buddies? Are they your good friends? When you're making a choice that is good for you and your health and well-being and all that stuff. Don't get me wrong, like I think there is like a classic part of male bonding that is a little bit of ribbing, a little bit of teasing, right? At the end of the day, like, I still feel that support and acceptance from, my core group of guy friends. And so I think it's questioning the quality of those relationships, and the reality is if your relationships are so scarce that that's all you have, you're going to cling to that relationship because it matters so much to you, even if it's not that good, right? And so I think that's really what's important. We do this one activity with youth in our program. We call it the web of support. And so if you imagine a group of us standing around in a circle, and I have a ball of string, and I only throw my string to you, Wes. So the string is connecting the two of us, and a life problem, comes down, and that life problem is the form of a balloon. If it hits the string, it's going to fall one side or the other because there's only one thing. But if we take that ball of yarn and we throw it to Joe over there, Todd over there, Mike over there, it becomes this kind of web of support. And the life problem falls down on that web of support, and it's held because there's now multiple strings connecting us, right? And so, there's research there that says you only need, two good friends, three good friends, or whatever. But like, sure, maybe that's fine. But like, where's your next level of acquaintances? Where's your next level of, neighbors? Where's your next level of community members, right? Like, we really do need that like web of support. And I think making decisions that move towards developing that web of support versus this group that, may make fun of you or judge you or whatever is the way to go. And what I'm thinking of as I'm saying that out loud is we also had one youth say to us in a survey that he has a group of guy friends, and he says it's the most unsupportive support group, right? And so like if that is your group that you turn to, your support group, and it is unsupportive, it's worth assessing, how you want to be in the world and what support and friendship and relationship mean to you.
Yeah, I think going off on that, there's two things that come to mind. I love that you challenge asking if they are real friends, because I think, and this comes from dialectical behavioral therapy. There's a section we call interpersonal effectiveness, and I always ask, do you know if you're good at school? Yes, by grades. Do you know if you're good at sports? Yes, by the score. How do you know you're good at relationships? What's our assessment and knowing on a qualification level? What would define a good and healthy relationship? And I think we do not properly assess that. We just take what we're given and we say, this is the norm. I guess this is what I'm dealt with. And it speaks to the tension you're saying of like, when you start to become aware and start doing the work and healing and growing as a person, you start realizing, wait, like these norms are broken and they're not functional by definition. And I think the first point is we need to start helping boys understand what it means to be a good friend and what it means to have a good friend in order to build those earlier on in life. So that way, you have a firmer foundation and a longer tenure of friends, because that's the other thing, many friendships are very temporary. But I think the second thing is saying, okay, yes, I want these things in my life, but how can I be that first? And it's the same romantically, right? Like, oh, I want my dream person and they have to have X, Y, and Z traits. Great. Do I have those same traits? How good of a listener am I? How much do I ask questions? And, how in tune am I with my emotional regulation, all that? So I think that's the first point. I think the second point is something that I had a guest recently, Nick Forshaw, and he runs the Paternal podcast. And he made a good point because I actually pushed and challenged and said, I think all your male friendships should be connected and they should be authentic and they should know you. And he was like, hey, I hear that. But he goes, actually, my approach is that I have some friends that I just watch the sports games with. And I realize those are my buds. Those are the guys that I just, drink beer and we talk about the game. And he's like, I can do that. And then he goes, but I make sure to have a core group of guys that are real, that they know about my marriage, how I am as a father, and I can really go deep with them. And he said, I actually don't see an issue with doing that. And I think, to me, the qualifying factor there is just to understand a guy's openness to that, And he made a really good point, is a really simple symptom that you can look for is just how many times does your friend ask a follow-up question? So if you're like, Jake, you mentioned I'm going through a separation. If I just breeze through, oh man, how about the Calgary Flame, whatever your Canadian hockey team is. But
That what you got it right. That was my team.
oh, did it? Yes. Okay, cool. And it's like, dude, I just missed an incredibly like important part, instead of being like, oh man, like how you doing with that? Like, how did that come about? Whatever it is. So simple, but I feel like yeah, to your point, we need to redefine normal in relationships and stop having unsupportive support groups.
And yeah, and I think I heard it online just because we all exist online now, but someone said that friendship is rude in the sense that like friendship also doesn't let you be like, nah, whatever, like blah, blah, blah. Friendship kind of asserts itself and says, like, you're moving, I'm here to help. Like, no, no, it's fine. I got a moving company. It's like, okay, well, I want to bring you the first case of beer to the new place or whatever, right? Like, it doesn't roll over, I guess, is that piece. And it's demanding. It's, I want to see you. I want to spend some time with you. I want to hear from you. I want to, And so I think that's also a good measuring stick of like, are we doing that? Because if everyone just kind of walks around and be like, "Oh, I'm fine. Like, yeah, when do you want to hang out? Like, whatever. Not really friendship.
Yeah, it takes genuine effort, just like a relationship, to maintain. You can't be reactive and wait for someone else. And, I always tell people, if someone doesn't text you back for like 4 days or they don't follow up on stuff, like that's negligent. Like that's not a good trait. And you can say, "Oh, well, maybe they're just going through a hard time, maybe." And fair enough. We all have those seasons where like genuinely, whether it's depression or grief or loss or something, blindsides us. But I would say that's a rarity. That's like saying I need my cell phone always on me because what if there an emergency happens? I think in general, you have to be consistent. You have to show up. And I think that is a trait that we're realizing both romantically and socially for our generation and future ones, necessary. And speaking of next generations, you are a new publisher of the Voicemail magazine, which I held
Yeah.
up earlier. I'll hold it up again just because it's so beautiful, folks. It's really a work of art and a insightful lesson and philosophical journey all in one. You are continuing a 40-year legacy of the pro-feminist men's movement. So I want to end with this major question based on that. What can today's generation of men learn from this history? And how has the conversation evolved since then?
Such a good question. So, I mean, voicemail's origins come out of the Men's Resource Center of Western Massachusetts in 1983. And it was a group of men that, were really trying to challenge a lot of the like system and the culture and, you know, being that pro-feminist group coming at it from working alongside, the women's movement and kind of gender justice and those types of things. And I think like, nowadays there is this big trend of like men's work and men's groups and those types of things. And I think that's really great. Where I think it falls a little short is gender based issues, patriarchal issues. These issues are not just impacting men, they're impacting, many of us in hetero relationships are in relationship with or want to be in relationship with. They're impacting our communities, our neighbors, our, trans and non binary neighbors are kind of under attack and those types of things. And so what I would say that we can learn from, that generation of men and carry into our men's work in this generation is really seeing that bigger picture that like men and masculinity is a part of the continuum. And how do we build bridges and understand, how we show up impacts other people and how they show up impacts us. Because if we want empathy, we need to also be able to give empathy.
Yeah, well said. I appreciate your insight because you are, yeah, taking the baton. And, I think a chronic issue many of us struggle with is, believing we're the new thing or we came up with something. And I think it's so important to name that this has been going on for so long. And while it's got a new way of being highlighted in society, is doing so in a way that is more normative and expansive. And it's something we certainly have to continue if we're going to continue on. And I like what you said, we are certainly a part, we're not the part. And I think that's a good reframe for seeing masculinity in light of patriarchy is that, men are important and they matter. We have a voice and we're not the only thing that matters. We're not the only thing with a voice. Mm, but, we have to start there and use our own voice to take up our space and also know when to give that space to others. So yeah, Jake, thank you for your time. Thank you for your wisdom and insight, and curious where people can find your work.
We're less active on socials these days, but at Next Gen Men on most of the platforms that matter. nextgenmen.ca. We are a Canadian organization after all, but we are more and more active in the US as well too, because we just saw each other in New York this week. And yeah, I think that that's where you can find us.
Thank you again. We'll put everything in the show notes. And guys, until next time.
Thanks so much, Wes.